"Get out of my office and never come back." Those words didn't just echo, they struck. I was still holding the black veil from my father's funeral when my sister, Cassandra, slammed the glass doors of Row Estate. "From now on, this legacy has no room for a hired hand like you," she declared. 10 years of my life erased. My name is Elena. 3 days ago, I buried my father only to lose my $92 million heritage in 1 week. In a moment of total betrayal, would you scream or quietly observe your enemy's next move? Share your perspective in the comments. I didn't drive back to the estate that night. I couldn't. The company-issued SUV had been remotely disabled before I even cleared my desk. I stood on the curb, watching the rain blur the streetlights, and called a rideshare to the studio apartment I'd kept as a silent contingency. Decisiveness is a form of currency in our industry, and I refused to let my account hit zero. I sat at a small wooden table, the air in the room smelling of stale dust, rather than the expensive oak of our private wine cellars. My father, Arthur, had been a man of calculated risks. A week before he passed, he handed me a heavy silver hard drive telling me to keep it off the company network. At the time, I didn't realize it was the primary key to my own survival. The fluorescent light overhead hummed a sharp, irritating frequency that matched the buzzing in my ears. I didn't reach for a glass of wine or call a friend. I reached for a legal pad. I began listing the sequence of events with the clinical detachment of an auditor. The lock on my sister's office had been changed at exactly 11:45 a.m., roughly 2 hours after the soil had settled on my father's casket. The speed of her betrayal was its own form of data. If I am being honest, I had spent years being the silent investor in her version of family. I funded her lifestyle with my labor, while she treated my dedication as a subscription she was entitled to for free. Looking back now, the coldness of my own actions was my greatest asset. I opened my personal laptop, a device Cassandra didn't even know existed, and connected the drive. I tried to access the main Row Estate server using my standard administrative credentials, only to see the screen flash red. Access denied, credentials flagged. My sister had been efficient, I will give her that. But then, the hard drive's interface bypassed the block, opening a localized directory. At the top of the list was a single, encrypted file titled Legacy Audit Arthur Row. That is when I realized some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. My father knew Cassandra's entitlement was a liability, and this family trust was his insurance policy. He had installed a specific integrity audit trigger. If the fund saw a 15% deviation in non-operational spending, the administrative keys would automatically migrate. I stared at the flickering cursor on the screen. The room felt smaller than it had 30 minutes ago, but for the first time, I didn't feel trapped. I felt like a forensic accountant about to open a set of books that had been cooked for decades. Cassandra thought she had won a sprint, but I was the one who designed the marathon. The document required a unique passphrase. I typed in the date of the first hotel we ever opened together. The system whirred, then a prompt appeared. Condition evaluation in progress. Violation detected, resident eviction. My breath hitched. My father hadn't just left me instructions. He had left a digital trap that Cassandra had walked directly into. The moment she slammed that door, Arthur Row had understood that you cannot inherit character. You can only demonstrate it under pressure. He had given Cassandra the $92 million keys, knowing she would not be able to resist the urge to lock me out. Every click of my mouse felt like a step toward an accounting she wasn't prepared for. I remember the cold mud on my boots at 2 a.m. It was the harvest of 2021, and a sudden frost threatened to devalue our entire vintage. While Cassandra was posting filtered photos of champagne towers in Saint-Tropez, I was in the trenches of our Napa vineyards, monitoring the wind machines and praying for a 1-degree shift in temperature. That was the reality of my 10 years at Row Estate. I wasn't the daughter who sat at the head of the table. I was the one who made sure there was a table to sit at. Arthur, my father, was a strict auditor of my performance. He never offered a word of praise, only more responsibility. He treated my presence in the boardroom as an overhead cost that had to be justified every single quarter. The survivor's invisible chain isn't made of iron, it is made of a misplaced belief that your endurance will eventually be credited as equity. Looking back now, I realize I accepted his grueling expectations, not because I was desperate for his affection, but because I respected the mechanics of what we were creating. I stayed because I loved the empire, not because I craved the crown. I became the primary operator of a $92 million system that Cassandra only viewed as a personal dividend. If I am being honest, I didn't realize until I was sitting in that cramped studio apartment how much I had sacrificed for a family that viewed my labor as a default setting. I had been the silent investor in their stability, footing the bill for their luxury with my own youth and sanity. It took me years to understand that my sister's entitlement was actually a form of blindness. She saw the glittering results, the 5-star reviews of our boutique hotels, the exclusive wine club memberships, the prestige of the row name, but she lacked the technical literacy to understand the grit it took to maintain them. To her, money was something that simply appeared in an account every 30 days. To me, it was the result of thousands of micro decisions made at 4 a.m. in a damp wine cellar. My father knew this. He had watched us both for 3 decades, measuring our worth not by our bloodline, but by our utility. I stared at the resident eviction notification on my laptop screen. The irony was almost clinical. Cassandra had used her temporary power to remove the only person who actually knew how to keep the business solvent. She had essentially fired her only competent engineer while the ship was still in deep water. As I sat there, the hum of the cheap refrigerator in my apartment felt like a ticking clock. My father's will wasn't a gift to his favorite child, it was a final harvest. He was straining out the greed to see if any integrity remained. My sister had failed the character test within the first 48 hours, and now the legal machinery Arthur Rowe had spent years building was starting to turn against her. I felt a quiet, chilling sense of clarity. Tomorrow, I would meet with the board of trustees, and I would show them exactly what happens when you try to run an empire on a budget of 0 character. The law is a slow-moving machine fueled by documentation. The meeting took place at 10 a.m. in a boardroom that felt like a glass cage. Theodore, the lead counsel for the board of trustees, sat at the head of a table made of reclaimed walnut, a table I had chosen myself 3 years ago. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a folder. "Elena," he said, his voice as dry as parchment, "the board has heard Cassandra's presentation on her new growth strategy. They've been swayed by her promises of immediate liquidation dividends, and per your father's instructions, we are initiating a 30-day operational review." 30 days. In the world of high-end logistics and hospitality, 30 days is an eternity. It is the difference between a thriving quarter and a total liquidation. But the board did not care about my urgency. They cared about the protocol. During this period, Theodore continued, Cassandra remains the interim managing partner. Your access to all company assets is suspended. If I am being honest, I expected a fight, but I did not expect to be treated like an unsecured debt. As I walked out of the building, my key fob for the company SUV blinked red. It had been deactivated remotely before I even reached the parking lot. I reached for my phone to call a rideshare, my fingers steady despite the chill. I wasn't just a woman without a car. I was a strategist whose primary transport had just been repossessed by a jealous tenant. By noon, my corporate credit card was declined. It had been deactivated remotely before I even reached the parking lot. I reached for my phone to call a rideshare, my fingers steady despite the chill. I wasn't just a woman without a car. I was a strategist whose primary transport had just been repossessed by a jealous tenant. This was a clinical execution of my daily life. Looking back now, I didn't realize that being stripped of everything was actually the most liberating part of the process. I stood on the sidewalk in the center of Napa, the late afternoon sky turning a bruised shade of gray, waiting for my second rideshare of the day. When the rain started, it wasn't the romantic drizzle of a vineyard tour. It was cold, heavy, and indifferent. I watched my former colleagues drive past in black sedans, their windows tinted to avoid the sight of the woman who had built their budget standing on the sidewalk. That is when I realized some forms of power are just fancy rentals that we mistake for permanent ownership. Cassandra was enjoying the occupancy, but she was not paying the maintenance. She had mistaken my silence for a lack of resources. She thought that by cutting my salary, she was cutting my oxygen. But I had been breathing thin air for 10 years while she was on a ventilator of father's money. The rideshare finally arrived, a nondescript sedan that smelled of artificial pine and the driver's long shift. I climbed on, clutching the silver hard drive inside my coat like a concealed weapon. I did not look back at the glass tower. I looked at my watch. The 30-day countdown had started, and Cassandra was already spending money that did not belong to her. She was throwing a lavish gala tomorrow night to celebrate her new reign. She did not know that every dollar she spent was being recorded in a ledger she could not see. Theodore's final words echoed in my mind as the bus pulled away. "Elena, the board isn't looking for a winner. They're looking for a survivor who knows how to account for every loss." The flickering screen was the only witness to the truth. I sat in the dim light of my studio apartment, the silver hard drive whirring under my fingertips like a quiet, metallic heart. It took me years to understand that my father's silence wasn't a lack of love, but a form of extreme observation. He was an architect of systems, and I was finally looking at the blueprint of his most private project. I entered the final passphrase, the coordinates of our first vineyard purchase in Napa Valley, and the screen transitioned from a harsh blue to a deep midnight black. A video file initialized. Arthur Rowe appeared looking older than I remembered, sitting in his favorite leather chair. "Elena," he began, his voice steady, carrying that familiar weight of a $92 million empire. "If you are watching this, it means the transition has begun. And if you are watching it from outside the estate network, it means your sister has already made her move." In hindsight, his foresight was the ultimate form of protection. He wasn't just predicting a family conflict. He was auditing a liability he had suspected for 3 decades. "I gave Cassandra temporary administrative control for 30 days, he continued, leaning toward the camera. "I framed it as a gift, but it was a stress test. Power is like fire. It reveals what it consumes. I needed to know if she had the operational integrity to protect you, or if she would attempt to liquidate your existence the moment I was gone." He paused, and for a second, I saw a flicker of genuine sadness in his eyes. "If she has evicted you, if she has stripped your resources, she has activated the self-destruct clause. She thinks she has inherited an empire, but she has actually inherited a 30-day probation that she has already failed." Arthur Rowe was never a fan of participation trophies. He understood that loyalty isn't a non-negotiable dividend. It is an earned asset. That is when I realized some people treat family as a limitless credit line, never realizing there is a hard cap on patience. Cassandra had spent 30 years overdrawing on a bank of grace that was now officially closed. The video ended, leaving me in a silence that felt heavier than the rain outside. I wasn't just Elena, the daughter who had been pushed into the mud. I was now the primary executor of a $92 million forensic trap. The board of trustees thought they were conducting an operational review. They didn't know they were actually witnessing a scheduled execution of Cassandra's special status. I looked at my watch. 28 days remained. The conference room was chilled to exactly 68 degrees today. Looking back now, the temperature was a perfect metaphor for the clinical nature of what was about to happen. Cassandra walked in at 10:03 a.m., wearing a $3,000 suit and a smile that suggested the world was hers for the taking. She carried herself with the heavy, unearned arrogance of someone who believes wealth is a birthright, rather than a responsibility. She didn't even acknowledge me as she sat at the head of the walnut table, the seat that had remained vacant since my father's funeral. Theodore didn't return her smile. He opened a leather-bound folder and began to read the results of the 30-day operational audit with the flat, emotionless tone of a judge delivering a verdict. It took me years to understand that some people view a legacy as a pile of cash to be consumed, rather than a system to be maintained. Theodore revealed the data. $700,000 had been drawn from the estate's preservation fund in just 4 weeks. She had exploited the corporate credit line, treating the company's operational capital as her own personal piggy bank under the guise of branding expenses. It wasn't just a spending spree. It was a blatant breach of her fiduciary duty to the Rowe Trust. She hadn't just spent money, she had committed a corporate felony. Cassandra had used it to finance her transition gala and a month of high-end retail therapy, believing the $92 million empire was her personal credit line. That is when I realized my sister had fallen for the oldest trap in the book. She confused occupancy with ownership. She thought the title of managing partner made her the owner, never realizing that in our father's world, every title was a probation period. The interim status was contingent on 2 factors, Theodore said, his eyes finally moving to Cassandra: fiscal stewardship and family care. He pushed a document across the table. It was the eviction notice she had served me time-stamped just 6 hours after the burial. By removing me from the property and freezing my access to the company's infrastructure, she hadn't just been cruel, she had triggered a mandatory disqualification clause. Power is often an illusion fueled by an empty wallet. Looking back now, I see that Cassandra's authority was essentially a rental agreement she had just breached. She sat there, her face draining of color as the board members shifted their gaze from the sister who was losing everything to the sister who had quietly documented every loss. Her $92 million fantasy was ending in a room full of men in suits who only respected one thing: the bottom line. Power does not evaporate, it simply changes hands in a different currency. It took exactly 5 minutes for my sister's manufactured reality to dissolve into clinical data. Theodore did not wait for her to process the shock. He called for a formal vote of the Board of Trustees, and the motion passed unanimously in under 60 seconds. Looking back now, I realized that the board wasn't exhibiting loyalty to me. They were exhibiting loyalty to the ledger. I was the one who could stabilize the $92 million empire. Cassandra was the one who had spent a month treating it like a personal lottery. Elena, Theodore said, standing up as the other members followed suit. The operational review is complete. Per the legacy audit protocol, you are hereby appointed as the permanent executive chair of Row Estate. He moved from the head of the table, creating the space for me to take the seat I had earned through 10 years of silent, mud-stained endurance. I didn't rush to claim it. I walked to the chair, feeling the weight of every late-night negotiation and every frostbitten harvest in my steps, and sat down. Cassandra's breathing was the only sound in the room, shallow, sharp, the sound of a luxury engine that had finally run out of borrowed fuel. I didn't feel the emotional rush of a victim's revenge. I felt the cold, familiar clarity of an auditor completing a complex reconciliation. My internal ledger was finally back in the black. I looked at my sister not with the anger of a victim, but with the detachment one might have for a failing asset that had reached the end of its utility. There is the matter of the $700,000, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the silence of her collapse. The board has classified those withdrawals as unauthorized personal loans against the company's capital. You have exactly 24 hours to initiate a full wire transfer back into the preservation fund. Theodore added the final lethal detail. Failure to comply will result in an immediate referral to the district attorney for embezzlement and fiduciary fraud. That is when I understood some forms of power are just fancy rentals that people mistake for ownership, because they've never had to pay the maintenance. Cassandra had mistaken my father's silence for permission, never realizing it was actually a period of observation. She didn't scream. She didn't have the energy for drama when her credit line had been terminated so publicly. She simply stood, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and walked toward the exit. The sound of her designer heels on the marble was her only departing statement, sharp, echoing, and entirely hollow. She left the room a $92 million stranger who finally realized she had never been part of the system. I watched the door close, then I turned back to the board. It was 10:08 a.m., and we had a business to rebuild. The sun began to crest over the Mayacamas Mountains at exactly 6:12 a.m. I stood among the vines of Block 4, the same rows of Cabernet Sauvignon that I had fought to save from the frost 3 winters ago. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the promise of a successful season. Looking back now, I realize that the silence of the vineyard at dawn is the only time the ledger of my life feels truly balanced. It is the only moment when the $92 million weight of this empire doesn't feel like a burden, but like an earned equity. Arthur Rowe was not a man of warm embraces or bedtime stories. To be completely candid, for most of my life, I viewed his strictness as a form of emotional withholding. I thought his constant demands for data, his refusal to overlook a single micro error in our logistics reports, and his insistence that I work from the bottom up were signs that I would never be enough. I spent a decade in the shadow of his expectations, watching Cassandra receive the jewelry, the travel, and the effortless affection, while I received only more work. It took me years to understand that my father wasn't being cruel. He was conducting a lifelong audit. He knew that one day he would not be here to protect the system he had built. He understood that a legacy isn't a trophy you hand to your children. It is a sophisticated machine that requires a specific type of literacy to operate. He gave Cassandra the affection because she was a consumer. He gave me the struggle because I was a builder. He knew that by the time he passed, I would have the operational integrity to survive his absence, while Cassandra would only have the appetite to consume his memory. That is the justice of the sower. My sister looked at this land and saw a backdrop for her social media feed. She looked at our father's bank accounts and saw a limitless credit line for a lifestyle she hadn't earned. I looked at the same things and saw the sweat of 3 generations and the responsibility to ensure a 4th. When she slammed that glass door in my face, she wasn't just evicting her sister. She was disqualifying herself from the very future she thought she had stolen. She didn't realize that in Arthur Rowe's world, power was never a birthright. It was a performance-based contract. The Rowe Foundation for Operational Integrity is now my primary project. I've taken the $700,000 that the board recovered from Cassandra's unauthorized spending and used it to seed a scholarship for young women in environmental, engineering, and agricultural logistics. It isn't an act of charity, it's an act of accounting. I want to find the other invisible daughters, the ones who are doing the work while others take the credit, and give them the infrastructure they deserve before they are pushed to their breaking point. If I am being honest, there are still nights when I sit in my father's leather chair and feel the echo of that slamming door. The betrayal of a sibling is a debt that never truly leaves the books. But then I look at the growth charts for the current season and I see the loyalty of the staff who stayed because they knew I was the one who understood the mechanics of their livelihood. I realize that the best revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies. It is the quiet, relentless building of a life that is so structurally sound, so authentic, that their attempts to dim your light only serve to highlight your brilliance. My father's will didn't just test my sister, it revealed me to myself. I am no longer the survivor hiding in a studio apartment with a silver hard drive. I am the architect of my own restoration. I didn't just inherit $92 million. I inherited the clarity to know that my value was never determined by a seat at the table, but by the fact that I was the one who built the room. Family is not a default setting. It is a commitment to mutual stewardship. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop paying the bill for a relationship where you are the only one invested. If this story resonated with you, I would really like to hear your perspective. Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between being the one who holds everything together and the one who finally sets a boundary for their own survival? What would you have done if you were in my place, standing on that cold sidewalk, watching your entire life be deactivated with a single click?